BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Tom Sanders. Good evening. President Trump has weighed into the general election campaign, saying that Jeremy Corbyn would be bad for the UK if he were elected Prime Minister. In an interview with Nigel Farage on LBC Radio, he said the Brexit Party leader and Boris Johnson should work together. Jeremy Corbyn has launched Labour's campaign, saying the election is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform the UK. The House of Representatives in the USA has voted to formalise the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. It means future investigation hearings will be held in public and televised. Pakistan's Prime Minister has ordered an inquiry into a fire which broke out on a packed train, killing at least 70 people. The World Organization for Animal Health has warned of food shortages and price rises and says a quarter of the planet's pig population could be wiped out by a strain of swine fever sweeping through Asia. Just a day into the general election campaign, President Trump has made an outspoken attack on Jeremy Corbyn, saying the Labour leader would be bad for the country, leading it to bad places. In contrast, he spoke in glowing terms about the Prime Minister, describing Boris Johnson as a fantastic man who he believed was exactly the right guy for the times. The President has been speaking to the Brexit leader Nigel Farage on his LBC radio show, where they discussed the NHS and a future trade deal between the US and Britain. His public intervention into the election campaign comes as Mr Trump faces an inquiry in the United States for allegedly soliciting foreign intervention in American politics. Joining us live in the studio is our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
There's an unwritten rule among politicians around the world that they don't interfere in each other's elections. It's seen as bad form, undiplomatic and generally unhelpful. So inevitably, it's something that comes naturally to Donald Trump. The US president chose the first day of the election campaign to be interviewed by Nigel Farage on LBC Radio, and he did not hold back. He said the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, would be so bad for Britain if he became Prime Minister.
I know that you and him will end up doing something that could be terrific. If you and he get together, it's, unstoppable force. And Corbyn would be so bad for your country. He'd be so bad. He'd take you in such a bad way. He'd take you into such bad places. But your country has tremendous potential. It's a great country.
As for Mr Johnson, there was some praise. Mr Trump said he was the right guy for the times. But the Prime Minister might not welcome the suggestion that he should join forces with Mr Farage, the Brexit Party leader. Mr Trump then said that together the two men could do something terrific and become what he called an unstoppable force. Mr Trump also placed an unhelpful question mark over one of Mr Johnson's key arguments for Brexit, saying that the government's withdrawal agreement with the EU could hamper a trade agreement with the United States. From Mr Corbyn's point of view, criticism from Donald Trump may be a badge of honour to take into an election campaign. For Mr Johnson, he could probably do without it. But the intervention is so early in the campaign, and it's always unclear whether these remarks have an impact in the long run.
Jeremy Corbyn launched his election campaign with a pledge to take on what he called the establishment elite of tax dodgers, dodgy landlords, bad bosses and polluters. He promised to transform Britain by taking on the few who he said ran a corrupt system. Mr Corbyn vowed to, in his words, get Brexit sorted in 6 months. And a chance of not for sale from the audience in South London, he said Labour would not let Donald Trump get his hands on the NHS. He brushed off poor personal poll ratings, stressing that a Labour government would bring real change to all parts of the country. Listening to his speech was our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
Jeremy Corbyn today launched what he claimed was the most radical, transformational election campaign in modern history, one he promised would take on the privileged elites in business, the media and politics and bring an end to this rigged system. Far from fearing such an uncompromising message might deter voters, Labour insiders believe there's a widespread fatigue with austerity, even among better-off communities, and an appetite for change. The party is also desperate to ensure this does not become a Brexit election. And while there were no new policy announcements today, Mr Corbyn confirmed Labour would scrap tuition fees, prescription charges and universal credit. They'd also nationalise the railways and offer free personal care and nursery provision. It was a plan, said Mr Corbyn, to transform and rebuild Britain.
Today, we launch the most ambitious and radical campaign our country has ever seen to bring real change to all parts of this country. If you want to live in a society that works for everybody, not just the billionaires, if you want to save our hospitals, schools and public services, then this election is your chance to vote for it.
It was a message which delighted his audience of party members who frequently cheered and at one point stamped and chanted in support as Mr Corbyn pledged to defend the NHS.
Our NHS, I simply say quite bluntly to everyone, it's not for sale.
On Brexit, Mr Corbyn said Boris Johnson alone was to blame for the failure to leave the EU by October the 31st. Mr Corbyn predicted this election would be harder and dirtier than any before as the establishment fought back. But he avoided a direct answer when asked if he would quit if he lost.
It's not about me. It's not about any individual on this platform. It's not a presidential election. It is about each and every one of us. And so I'll be all over the country, meeting people, listening to people and taking that message there.
Mr Corbyn's speech will have motivated and excited his natural supporters. Less clear is how far it will resonate with the wider electorate. Labour insiders proudly proclaim their manifesto will be even more radical than that of 2017, in the belief that after 2 more years of austerity, the country is now looking for a very different sort of government.
Out on the campaign trail in Cambridge, Boris Johnson acknowledged his frustration that Britain wasn't leaving the EU today, his original deadline. But he promised to deliver Brexit by January at the absolute latest if the Conservatives won the election. Our political correspondent Chris Mason has spent the day with the Prime Minister.
Around Westminster for months, there's been a certain machismo surrounding countdown clocks. Timepieces set to reach zero today. The day, or most recent day, when the UK was due to leave the European Union. The day the Prime Minister promised we would be out. But they've been reset. Not yet for the end of January, the next Brexit deadline, but for 6 weeks today, General Election Day. This election, like the last, has been caused by Brexit. Boris Johnson desperate to blame others for his failure to deliver it and to stress his commitment to actually doing so if he wins a majority. But Mr Johnson seems determined to learn the lessons of the Conservative campaign.